Just 1 minute ago, a sudden Supreme Court decision hit Britain like a lightning strike, so fast, so unexpected that even Prime Minister Keir Starmer was caught completely off guard. The ruling spread across government halls like a shockwave, freezing ministers mid-sentence, sending advisers scrambling and leaving the entire nation asking the same terrifying question. Has the Supreme Court just triggered a political collapse? What happened inside that courtroom is already being called one of the most dramatic judicial interventions in British history, and Starmer's reaction has only added fuel to the growing chaos. In the space of a single minute, Britain shifted from uneasy tension to full-blown political panic. The Supreme Court's ruling, released without warning in a blunt, sharply worded statement, landed like a bombshell on the Prime Minister's desk. Officials inside Downing Street said Starmer's expression changed instantly, first confusion, then disbelief, and finally something much darker, the realisation that his government was now standing on dangerously unstable ground. The judgment didn't just challenge a policy or overturn a minor decision, it struck directly at the heart of Starmer's authority, questioning the legality of his most controversial move to date. As the first lines of the ruling raced through social media, the reactions exploded almost instantly. Government critics celebrated, opposition MPs demanded answers, and reporters outside Westminster pushed through crowds, shouting questions that no one seemed willing to answer. Inside the Supreme Court, tension still hung in the air long after the judges had left the chamber. Legal analysts described the moment as chilling. The language was precise, brutal, and unmistakable. The court had effectively declared that the Prime Minister had overstepped his constitutional limits, creating a crisis that no one in government had prepared for. Meanwhile, just a few streets away, aides rushed from room to room inside Downing Street, clutching printed copies of the ruling, whispering urgently, trying to understand how the situation had spiralled so fast. One advisor was overheard, saying it felt like the ground had opened under the entire government. But the most shocking detail of all was the timing. The decision was released moments before a major parliamentary announcement, completely derailing Starmer's plan and leaving his inner circle blindsided in the most humiliating way possible. As the chaos grew, political commentators began repeating the same theme. This wasn't just a legal setback. This was a direct challenge to Starmer's power. The ruling questioned procedures, motives, and even the internal workings of the government, creating the impression of a leadership losing control. The public reaction turned fierce as protests formed within minutes outside major government buildings. Cars stopped in the streets. Office workers gathered around screens and phones buzzed with urgent notifications, each new detail more dramatic than the last. Rumours spread that several senior ministers were refusing to defend the Prime Minister's position until they had full clarity, a phrase which sounded eerily like a soft rebellion. Even members of Starmer's own party appeared uncertain, giving interviews filled with vague, cautious language, clearly afraid of saying something that might spark even more trouble. Meanwhile, insiders revealed that emergency meetings were being arranged at a frantic pace. Ministers were being pulled from live interviews, officials were told to stay inside their offices, and civil servants were instructed not to comment on anything until further notice. The atmosphere inside Westminster shifted from routine politics to something much more unstable, something unpredictable, volatile, and dangerous. Commentators began warning that Britain was entering a constitutional storm unlike anything seen in recent years. And through it all, one question echoed louder than anything else. What will Starmer do now? The Supreme Court had delivered its blow. The public was reacting with fury and the political establishment was shaking. Britain was no longer simply watching events unfold. It was bracing for the next shockwave. The aftermath of the Supreme Court ruling quickly unfolded into a spectacle of confusion and fierce debate. Inside Parliament, the mood was tense as Labour MPs scrambled to regroup. Whispers of discontent and fear rippled through the ranks, with some openly questioning Starmer's leadership for the first time. Across the aisles, opposition parties smelled blood, seizing the moment to hammer home their criticisms with renewed vigour. Tory MPs, once cautious, now openly demanded a formal inquiry into the government's actions that led to this unprecedented judicial reprimand. The Commons chamber buzzed with sharp exchanges and pointed accusations as the country's political future suddenly seemed uncertain. Starmer himself, caught in the eye of this storm, was reported to have spent hours locked in a private meeting with his closest advisers. Sources close to the Prime Minister revealed he was grappling with how to respond, not just legally, but politically. The ruling's implications reached far beyond the courtroom. It had called into question the very foundation of the government's recent decisions, undermining public trust at a critical moment. Rumours circulated of a crisis team being formed to manage the fallout, tasked with damage control that stretched from media appearances to emergency briefings for party members. However, every move seemed weighed down by the shadow of the Supreme Court's declaration, making it difficult to regain control. As the day wore on, the media frenzy intensified. Headlines screamed of constitutional crisis, government in turmoil, and Starmer's leadership in jeopardy. Pundits debated endlessly on television and radio, dissecting every word of the ruling and speculating on what it meant for Britain's future. Social media platforms exploded with outrage and confusion. Some defended the court's decision as a necessary check on government power, while others feared it signalled chaos and instability. The atmosphere was electric, charged with a mixture of anger, disbelief, and anticipation for what would happen next. Ordinary citizens too found themselves caught up in the drama, discussing the crisis in homes, workplaces and online communities, unsure of what the Supreme Court's verdict truly meant for their daily lives. Meanwhile, whispers of dissent grew louder within Labour's own ranks. Trusted allies of Starmer began voicing concerns behind closed doors, worried that the ruling could trigger a wider loss of confidence in his leadership. Some senior figures reportedly urged the Prime Minister to consider stepping back temporarily or reshaping his cabinet to restore calm. Yet others warned that any sign of weakness would only deepen the crisis. This internal division was a stark contrast to the usual image of a united party front and highlighted the deep unease spreading through the corridors of power. The threat of rebellion loomed as the party struggled to balance loyalty with the urgent need for a credible response. In Westminster, the government's legal team scrambled to prepare a formal appeal, but the tight time frame and the gravity of the ruling complicated matters. Legally, experts warned that overturning the decision would be a long and uncertain battle, one that might prolong the political turmoil rather than resolve it. At the same time, ministers faced mounting pressure to deliver clear answers to the public and Parliament. Yet official statements remained deliberately vague, feeding suspicion and frustration. The opposition seized on this silence, accusing Starmer of evading responsibility and failing to show leadership in a moment of crisis. The mounting distrust only deepened the sense that Britain was hurtling towards an unprecedented constitutional showdown. Across the country, the ripple effects of the Supreme Court's ruling became increasingly visible. In local governments, council leaders expressed alarm at the uncertainty, fearing disruption to essential services and planning. Business leaders warned that political instability could scare away investment, risking the fragile economic recovery. Meanwhile, grassroots activists and campaigners took to the streets in protest, some demanding the government's resignation, others calling for greater transparency and accountability. The nation's divisions, already deep, were now laid bare for all to see, as the ruling served as a catalyst for unrest and debate. It was clear that the crisis was not confined to Westminster, it was spreading, and no corner of Britain seemed immune. Through it all, Starmer's resolve was tested like never before. Sources inside his team described a man under enormous pressure, trying to balance legal strategy, political survival, and the growing demand for clarity from a nervous public. Yet despite the mounting challenges, there was no immediate sign of capitulation or retreat. Instead, Starmer's circle emphasised a message of resilience and determination, framing the crisis as a moment of challenge to be overcome rather than a defeat. But whether this approach would succeed in calming the storm remained to be seen. With every passing hour, the stakes rose higher, and the question on everyone's mind became more urgent. Could the Prime Minister navigate Britain out of this chaos? Or was the nation on the brink of a breakdown unlike any before? As the dust began to settle, the political battlefield only grew more treacherous. Starmer's opponents, sensing vulnerability, sharpened their attacks with ruthless precision. Former allies turned critics appeared on every platform, questioning not just the Supreme Court ruling, but the very competency of Starmer's government. Editorials labelled the crisis a defining moment for British democracy, one that could either strengthen institutions or unravel them completely. Within Labour's shadow cabinet, whispers of discontent had grown into louder murmurs. Some feared that the prolonged chaos might irreparably damage the party's reputation and electoral prospects, while others argued that a firm stance against what they called judicial overreach was necessary to rally their base. The internal struggle over how to respond was fierce, with factions pulling in different directions, some demanding transparency and reform, others advocating for silence and strategic retreat. Meanwhile, the government's legislative agenda ground to a halt. Key bills were delayed indefinitely as ministers focused on crisis management, leaving pressing national issues like healthcare, the economy, and foreign relations in the background. Parliament's usual rhythm was replaced by heated debates centred on the constitutional crisis, with the opposition relentless in demanding accountability. The Prime Minister faced difficult questions about his future, with speculation mounting about whether he could survive politically amid mounting pressures. Polls showed a sharp drop in public support for Starmer and his party, while confidence in the judiciary soared, highlighting the deep division between political leadership and public trust. The crisis was not just about legal technicalities anymore, it had become a battle for the soul of British governance. International observers watched with growing concern. Allies and rivals alike noted the instability gripping Britain's political scene, raising questions about how this turmoil might affect the country's standing on the world stage. Diplomatic sources hinted at private conversations where foreign leaders expressed worry about Britain's ability to maintain steady leadership during such unprecedented internal conflict. Economic analysts warned that prolonged uncertainty could impact markets, investment, and the country's recovery from global challenges. The ruling sent shockwaves far beyond the courtroom, rippling through international relations and the global financial system. As Britain's institutions wavered, the world watched closely, some with sympathy, others with anticipation. Back inside Downing Street, the atmosphere was increasingly tense and fractured. Reports emerged of heated exchanges during emergency meetings, with senior officials debating fiercely over the next steps. Some urged the Prime Minister to call an early election as a way to reset the political landscape, while others pushed for constitutional reforms to clarify the balance of powers and prevent future crises. The question of leadership became unavoidable. Starmer, once seen as a steady hand, now faced the possibility of losing the confidence of his own party and the electorate. His closest advisers were said to be divided on whether he should double down and fight the ruling or seek compromise. This internal discord, leaking through unofficial channels, only added to the public sense of chaos. At the grassroots level, the ruling ignited fierce debate and activism. Campaign groups rallied around different interpretations of the crisis, with some demanding radical change to the country's political system and others defending the judiciary's role as a necessary check on government power. Demonstrations and counter-demonstrations unfolded across cities, sometimes peaceful, other times erupting into clashes with police. The crisis had sparked a wider conversation about democracy, justice, and accountability. Questions that cut to the heart of what it meant to be British in a time of turmoil. Citizens who once felt disconnected from politics suddenly found themselves engaged and passionate as the crisis forced everyone to confront the fragility of their institutions. Amidst the chaos, the media played a crucial role in shaping public perception. News outlets and social media channels became battlegrounds for competing narratives. Some framed the ruling as a victory for democracy and the rule of law, praising the judiciary for holding the government to account. Others portrayed it as an overreach that threatened to undermine elected leadership and fuel division. Disinformation and conspiracy theories began to spread, complicating efforts to deliver clear, factual information. The result was a nation polarised not only by politics, but by how it understood the crisis itself. This information war made it harder for leaders to calm fears or build consensus. as every statement was scrutinised and every action questioned. Despite the mounting difficulties, Starmer showed signs of resilience. In carefully crafted messages, he promised to respect the Supreme Court's ruling while pledging to work towards solutions that would restore trust and stability. His speeches emphasised unity and responsibility, seeking to reassure a nervous public, yet the gap between words and reality remained wide, and many questioned whether these promises could translate into effective action. The Prime Minister's ability to steer Britain through this storm was being tested like never before. The path forward was unclear, fraught with legal battles, political rivalries and social unrest. Every decision carried weighty consequences and the stakes could not be higher. Britain's future hung in the balance, teetering on the edge of order and chaos. As the crisis deepened, every corner of Britain seemed to feel the tremors from the Supreme Court's seismic decision. Political leaders scrambled to craft responses that might stem the tide of chaos, but the truth was clear. Nothing would be easy or quick. Starmer's government was fighting on multiple fronts: legal, political and public opinion all at once. Behind closed doors, emergency meetings turned into battles over strategy and survival as advisors debated how to regain control of a narrative spinning wildly beyond their grasp. The Prime Minister was no longer just facing a court ruling. He was confronting a crisis of legitimacy, a profound questioning of his ability to lead a nation already strained by economic pressures and social divides. The Supreme Court's judgment had opened a Pandora's box, one that brought long-standing constitutional questions into the harsh light of day. Legal experts pointed out that the ruling set a precedent that could reshape the relationship between the judiciary and the executive branch for years to come. Some feared this could lead to further clashes between courts and governments, undermining the principle of separation of powers that underpins British democracy. Others saw it as a necessary recalibration, a reminder that no leader, no matter how powerful, is above the law. But the immediate impact was undeniable. Britain found itself caught in a constitutional crossfire, uncertain how to proceed without risking further damage to its fragile institutions. Public confidence, once a steady pillar beneath the government, now wavered dangerously. Polls showed a growing number of citizens doubting Starmer's leadership, with many expressing fear that the country was heading into uncharted and unstable territory. This widespread anxiety was visible in the streets, where protests continued to flare up, fueled by frustration and distrust. Community leaders and activists called for calm and dialogue, warning against letting the crisis spiral into deeper division. Yet the divisions ran deep, cutting across political, social and regional lines. The crisis was more than a legal battle. It had become a test of Britain's resilience as a nation and a democracy. Within the political arena, the pressure mounted relentlessly. Starmer faced mounting calls from both allies and opponents to clarify his vision for moving forward. Some suggested drastic measures, reshuffling his cabinet, calling for an early election, or even stepping down to preserve party unity. Others urged patience and prudence, arguing that the crisis was temporary and could be managed with careful leadership. But the fractures within Labour's ranks grew harder to contain. Leaks to the media hinted at simmering resentment and power struggles, while opposition parties seized every opportunity to push for Starmer's resignation. The Prime Minister's ability to hold his party together and maintain public support was under more strain than ever before. As legal teams prepared appeals and bars and parliamentary debates grew more heated, the spotlight remained fixed firmly on Starmer. Every decision he made was analysed for signs of strength or weakness. The public watched closely, eager for reassurance, but often finding only uncertainty. At the same time, international observers continued to monitor Britain's unfolding crisis with keen interest, aware that the outcome would have significant implications beyond its borders. Allies hoped for stability, while rivals looked for opportunities in the nation's moment of vulnerability. Britain's global reputation and influence were at stake, tied directly to how this internal turmoil would be resolved. Through it all, one undeniable truth emerged. The Supreme Court's ruling was not just a legal judgment, it was a catalyst for a profound reckoning. Britain was being forced to confront fundamental questions about power, governance and democracy. The institutions that had long provided stability were now under intense scrutiny, and the path ahead was uncertain and fraught with risk. The crisis had stripped away much of the usual political polish, exposing raw nerves and unresolved tensions. The nation stood at a crossroads, its future hanging in the balance between order and chaos, unity and division. As the country waited with bated breath, the coming days promised to be some of the most turbulent in recent history. Starmer's next moves would be critical, shaping not only his political fate, but the fate of Britain itself. Would he rise to the challenge and steer the nation back from the brink, or would the shockwaves from the Supreme Court ruling continue to ripple, threatening to bring the entire government crashing down? The answers were still unknown, but one thing was certain. Britain was in the grip of a crisis that would be remembered for years to come.